Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about Minnesota. Several people have talked some about places they've come from, and I have not given you guys any talk about Minnesota. Minnesota is a name that means essentially blue water. It might mean sort of cloudy blue water, clear blue water. It's a Native American word of some kind, and this was what some Native American tribe called this land and called a river. And the white settlers picked this up. Minnesota is kind of right in the middle of the U.S. on the northern edge. So as you borders on Canada, it has a bit of a sort of a coastline on Lake Superior. And you see a lot of sort of blue in there. Minnesota has a lot of lakes, and we'll get to that in a minute. Minnesota is very much what is considered by a lot of people to be flyover country. When you look at it from an airplane, this is what you see for a lot of it. Especially the southern part of the state is almost all farmland. It's almost all agricultural. When you go farther north, there's actually quite a lot of forestry. It looks like somewhere farther north. Basically, the territory looks a lot like what you find in Sweden, which is probably why people like Swedes found this to be a nice part of the country to move to. It's a lot of it is fairly flat, and a lot of it gets to be a bit more mountainous and forested. The largest city is Minneapolis. Here's an aerial view of downtown Minneapolis. Minneapolis, together with St. Paul, they're called the Twin Cities. They're actually, so it's two distinct downtown areas that are about 10 miles apart. But like that whole space between is all sort of solid city. Like driving from one to the other, you don't drive like through a countryside. It's all just built up solid everywhere. Here's another picture of Minneapolis from near the river. So this is actually the Mississippi River, which runs right through Minneapolis. I'll get to more about the river a little bit later. So Minneapolis is the largest city in the state. The second largest is St. Paul, which is actually the capital. Here's St. Paul in wintertime. This has also a river running through it. I think this is actually the St. Croix River. So near St. Paul, the Minnesota River connects these two sort of branches. Mississippi River has these two branches. One is actually called the St. Croix River. But they're both quite big rivers that sort of merge together south of the cities. This is the capital. You can see it doesn't have quite as many large buildings as Minneapolis does. The third largest city is Rochester, which is where the famous Mayo Clinic is. And most of these biggest buildings in downtown Rochester are the Mayo Clinic. It's just a huge hospital research area. There's very little else going on in Rochester in terms of like big industries or commerce. It's mostly Mayo Clinic. So Minnesota is often called the land of 10,000 lakes. And if you look at this map, you can see there's a lot of blue, there are a lot of small lakes. I read online that there are almost 12,000 lakes that are each of a certain size. What was it, 10 acres or something? So I mean, if you count even smaller things, you can probably count more. But 10,000 seems like it's about right. I actually grew up mostly down in Mower County in southern Minnesota, which is, I can't put it out here. It's the only county in Minnesota that does not have any natural lakes. It does have one sort of man-made reservoir in the town I grew up in, but no actual lakes. There are rivers running through it. There are rivers and creeks, but no lakes.
Is that it at the very bottom?
Yeah, down at the bottom.
Okay.
You see Mower.
Between Jackson and Fairfield?
It's here. Mower County.
Oh, I see. Mower. Okay.
Yeah, it looks like Mower, but it's pronounced Mower.
Got
I
it.
don't know why. But so there are a lot of lakes. Here is a typical Minnesota lake. This is one called Pigeon Lake. I'm not sure where this is. This next one, this is called Lake of the Isles. This is actually in Minneapolis. So you can see some tall buildings off in the distance. This is like within, like if you were in downtown Minneapolis and sat in a car, you could drive here in 2 or 3 minutes. It's very, very close by. There are a few lakes right near downtown Minneapolis like this. And it's called Lake of the Isles because there are some islands in it. And it's like in most places where, in sort of urban area that has water access, you can rent boats and paddle around, that kind of thing. I also mentioned that it has kind of a coastline in terms of being on Lake Superior. This is what's called the North Shore. So the northern shore of Lake Superior has a lot of these rocky outcroppings and lighthouses, and it's got kind of a nice touristy place to go and visit and hang out at a bed and breakfast, that kind of thing. Lake Superior is a big enough lake that if you're standing on the shore and looking out across it, you can imagine you're on the ocean. There's no way to see the other side. I mentioned the Mississippi River. This is one of the most important rivers in the U.S. in terms of how it's been used for commerce and things over the years, and still is. There's still a lot of big barge traffic going up and down the river, delivering things to and from. So you can get in a boat in Minnesota and float all the way down to New Orleans if you want to. The Mississippi River does originate in Minnesota in a small lake called Lake Itasca, which is up at the upper end of that. And it's a nice big river. There's a lot of beautiful scenery along this river. Here's a nice photo someone took in the fall sometime. This used to be a glacial river, so the river valley is much, much bigger than the river is today. So much of the Mississippi River, especially up in the Minnesota area, consists of like this. It's essentially a great giant gorge with a small-ish river in the bottom of it. The river seems small compared to the gorge that it's in, but it's actually a very, very wide and deep river also. There are a fair number of famous Minnesotans. Musicians like Prince and Bob Dylan and the Andrews Sisters are from Minnesota. Filmmakers like the Coen brothers and Terry Gilliam. Number of actors and actresses. Charles Schultz, who drew Peanuts, he's from Minnesota. These are kind of the biggest, most well-known people I could find from Minnesota. So it's not, we can't get with a list of like 100 amazing celebrities from Minnesota that easily, but there are some. In terms of demographics, Minnesota is typically thought of as being a very sort of Scandinavian state in terms of its population, and I think that is generally true. Although if you look at the actual things, when people report their primary ancestry, the biggest single percentage will be German, almost 40%, and a little over 32% will say Nordic. But almost everyone will also tell you that some portion of their ancestry is Scandinavian. So I would say well over half will say that, okay, sure, I'm a quarter Danish, or at least an eighth Norwegian, or whatever. So it's very widespread, and I think that the sort of outlook of people in Minnesota and kind of the habits that people have tends to have a lot to do with Scandinavian outlook and values and things. It tends to be a pretty sort of relaxed culture, and people are not sort of pushing themselves forward, and people are not super boastful. People are not super aggressive. It's pretty laid back in a lot of ways. I want to point out a few little things that I have encountered and been aware of during my time in Minnesota. So I should mention I lived in Minnesota from the age of 10 until about 26 or 27. So I spent half my childhood and a chunk of my adulthood there as well. There's a cute little town called Skandia, which has a little farm yard called Gamla Gordon. And this is actually this was not like somebody's farm that is still standing there. This is basically a museum that is built up with buildings that were constructed by immigrant Swedes and probably Norwegians at various points nearby, and they were all sort of packed up and moved there. So there are these old barns that were sort of taken apart piece by piece and then reassembled on this spot. In the middle of this red building is obviously not an old building. I was there once when it just happened to be open that day because they had a group of visiting Swedes who were touring, and we got to follow along the tour. That was pretty fun to see. Just talked about what life was probably like for immigrants who came to Minnesota 150 years ago. Because what you saw in the picture, like I showed you this sort of flyover country, right, where it's all farmland. 150 years ago, it was not farmland. That was all prairie grass, which is 2 meters high and has roots that go 2 meters deep. So in order to farm any of that land, you have to tear that stuff all up or burn it all down. So you have to spend you have to spend like who knows how much time and labor to actually make that land farmable. So it was a lot of strenuous work for people who came here, and many of them wished they had stayed home. The town that I grew up in is Austin, Minnesota, and the most famous thing to come out of Austin is probably Spam. That is the actual Spam, the actual meat product. Austin is the headquarters of Hormel, which makes Spam, and Hormel in Austin is pronounced Hormel. Honestly, everyone else calls it Hormel. In Austin, it is called Hormel. Another sort of generalization about Minnesota is that it's a very sort of cold and snowy place in the winter, and that is very much true. I found a few photos. This photo looks really terrible on the big screen, but this is sort of a typical winter scene. All the cars covered with snow, and some miserable dude out there trying to shovel his way out. Here is a typical Minnesota wintertime snowdrift blocking the entire front of somebody's house. I mean, this was, when I was a kid, this is what it looked like a lot in the wintertime. We had a lot of snow. One thing that Minneapolis used to have is a domed stadium called the Metrodome. It's actually been torn down now. The Metrodome had a roof that was not structurally sound. Okay.
Nah, I think you're out of space or something.
Really? I freed up
It
space.
stopped, but now I started it again. So
Okay.
I guess we're doing.
No, it stopped
it's
again.
stopping. Yeah, it stops itself.
Okay.
Maybe because.
I cleared up. I made sure I had over 1 gigabyte of space.
Oh. There's not enough available storage.
Okay. Oh well, forget it.
Oh.
Forget it. This is more for you guys than for the. So the Metrodome, it did not have a roof that was like a structurally complete roof. It was actually held up by air pressure. So it was kind of like an inflated roof. And one winter, famously, this happened. There was so much snow that the roof collapsed, which was a problem. And that's it.
Cool. Thanks.